And this is what our sway bar looks like when it's installed. It installs right onto the hangers for your shocks right here at the bottom, and it's an additional sway bar that is installed here at the rear. Our factory sway bar is still present right here, heading towards the front of the vehicle, off on the front of our axle, and our new sway bar here is installed towards the rear of the axle. This is going to work in conjunction with your factory sway bar to further reduce sway. It works in the same way as your factory one does, but the additional one that we've installed on here is a little bit larger diameter than the factory one. And since we're adding it to this one, we're almost doubling the amount of anti-sway that we've got here with these components. The way our sway bars work, if we look at either of them, the factory one or with the Roadmaster one that we installed, both of them are attached to the axle here, and then the arms go out and connect to end links that connect up to the frame. So the way this works is our axle here is pretty much always going to be on the ground. You know, your tires are always going to be on the road. But as you're driving, your body of your vehicle here is supported by your suspension above the axle. So they're kind of like this. And as you're going down the road, you get a heavy crosswind and it blows your body, or you hit a pothole or make a turn, your body kind of moves on the suspension on your axle here. So let's just say, for example, you're driving by and have a heavy crosswind that hits you. Maybe a big old semi drives by and it blows the body of your motorhome like this. So our axle's still going to be on the road, but our body's now moved. And you can see here that on this side, the body's now a little bit closer to the axle, and on the opposite side over here, it's a little bit further away. What's happening here is that as it moves like this, over like that, as the frame gets closer to the axle here, the end link pushes downward on our arm here. It would be the opposite for the one here in the back. Well, actually, no, it'd still be pushing down on it. On the other side, where it's a little bit further away, that end link's connected to our bar over there, and it's going to be pulling up on the arm on the opposite side. So kind of like this, it does a twisting motion on our bar. Well, this big old metal bar here is molded in this specific shape, and when your vehicle is just sitting there in its normal rested loaded state, this is how it wants to be. So once the body starts to sway, it's twisting the bar out of its normal shape, and the spring bar here doesn't want it to, so it brings itself back to its normal shape. Same with both the factory one and with our Roadmaster one here. And by pushing it back, it brings our vehicle back upright. So this is going to minimize how much that it can sway, because the bar doesn't want to twist, but it will some. And then when it does bring your vehicle back upright, it is able to do so quicker without moving as much. So if you don't have an additional sway bar here and you experience more sway, whenever you sway one direction, when the vehicle goes to straighten itself out, the momentum is there, and it often goes past center and it sways a little bit the other direction. It kind of oscillates back and forth just a little bit and straightens itself back out. By adding an additional bar here, that minimizes how much that happens. So you might go one direction, you might come back just a little bit and then straighten right back out without having a couple of back and forth little sways in there. Sway bars are a great way to help tame these big motorhomes, because as you're driving down the road, you know what it's like when you hit those potholes and stuff, and it starts to really veer the motorhome. You have to compensate in the steering wheel to make sure that you stay in your lane and keep all your passengers safe. So by increasing the amount of anti-sway you got, there's less that you have to compensate for, offering a safer ride. This is also going to be more comfortable for your passengers, because as the motorhome's not swaying around as much, it's going to be more comfortable for all the passengers inside. And it's also going to be less work for you, reducing the amount of fatigue that you experience when controlling these big old motorhomes. To further reduce the amount of sway and tame these big old beasts, to make them easier to handle and drive, I would also recommend replacing the front sway bar. You can get that here from Roadmaster. That one is going to be a direct replacement of the front bar, but you're going to get a bigger, larger, more robust bar to replace it to further reduce sway over the factory one. In addition to sway bars, I would also recommend Sumo springs. You can get those here at etrailer, and those install, and you can get them for both the front and the rear, and they go between the frame and the suspension here, and they will compress to help absorb some of those impacts on the road from potholes, and they also work together with your sway bar and suspension to help reduce sway and give you more control over your motorhome. The last component that I would recommend doesn't really help out with sway or your suspension, but helps out with controlling the motorhome and making sure you're safe and reducing the amount of effort it takes to drive the motorhome, is a steering stabilizer. You can get that here from Roadmaster, and they connect up at the front on the tie rod that goes across. And the purpose of those is to help keep the steering wheel at center and to absorb any impacts on the road. So when you hit a pothole, you know how that wheel goes boom, it really wants to turn on you and you're gonna grab it and keep yourself nice and straight again. Well, with the dampening absorber and those steering stabilizers, the amount that it wants to jerk the wheel is going to be reduced because the shock absorber on there is going to absorb some of that impact. There's also a coiled spring on it as well, so if it does jerk the wheel to the left or to the right, that coiled spring, when it's set up in the neutral straight steering wheel position, so it either stretch or compress the spring, and the spring wants to be in its normal resting state, so it will either expand itself back out or compress itself back together and help bring that steering wheel back to center, so it's not just you fighting all those road forces. Altogether, that full suite of suspension and steering upgrades really does make a huge difference in how much effort you have to put into controlling these motorhomes, and it will give you the confidence that you might be lacking on some of those longer trips, because once you feel the difference, you know your family's going to be much safer and more comfortable in your upgraded motorhome. And here we're just looking at the sway bar from the rear view now, so you can get a little bit better look at it. You can see here's the end links. They are much larger and more robust than your factory ones. You've got the hangers that install here, and you can see that it is very similar to the front one, but it is going to be a much bigger bar than the front one is. All the components are going to be heavier duty, including our bushings as well. The neoprene bushings are going to be much stronger than the factory one. So this bar is something that's probably going to outlast that factory one. That one is likely going to need service before this one. And actually, when we first started this installation, we didn't really show it during the process of installing it, but we always do a quick suspension inspection before we put these parts on to make sure that if they are experiencing an issue, it's not because of a broken component. And we actually found that the bushing caps were loose on the factory sway bar, which was giving additional play in there, which was reducing the amount of anti-sway properties that bar could provide. So now that we've tightened those up and installed this one, it's going to make a big difference. But I do always recommend every time you're going to do any upgrade, inspect your components while you're down here, because you might find that there's something else causing some issues that you may need to address. Now that we've covered some of the features of our sway bar, why don't you follow along with me and we'll show you how to get it installed. This is going to require you to place the motorhome, raise it up with your hydraulic jacks if you've got on hand, or if you have a jack big enough, you can use that to jack your motorhome up. But the majority of this we are going to need to do right there on the ground with it level to get everything set up appropriately. We'll begin our installation here at the back of the vehicle. We're going to be removing a couple of bolts on the side of the frame. Now, when you first get over here to remove these bolts, you might notice that the leaf spring stack is right in front of the bolts that we're wanting to remove. So in order to get the clearance, we need to get these bolts out of there. We use the leveling jacks that's on our vehicle. We just kind of lowered those down to lift up on the body, and that helps move the frame up away from the leaf spring stack so we can get the bolts removed. Once you get it lifted up, I do recommend putting jack stands underneath the frame, so that way you've got some supports under there, so you're not trusting just your hydraulics to hold the vehicle up while you're working. Once you've got it all supported though, we can head in here to the wheel well and get the bolts removed. We're going to be removing the two lower bolts that you see here. It's just behind our tire. There's the leaf spring stack, so when you're down on the ground, that is going to be kind of covering them up, so that's why we had to use the leveling jacks to lift it up a little bit. And just use your 21mm socket now to remove both of these. If you've got a decent impact, it should zip them right out of there. There we go. And you do not need to hold the nut on the other side, because it has a little flange on it that prevents it from spinning. Now, if the nuts fall on the ground, no big deal, but there's a good chance they're just going to hang out on the frame there. That's fine. We're going to reuse this hardware to install the bracket that comes in our kit. So now that we've got both bolts removed, I'm going to roll under there and we'll get that bracket put on. This is the bracket we're going to install. You're going to get two of these in the kit, so everything we do on this side, we're going to repeat on the other side. Both the brackets are the same, so they are interchangeable. We want the outside here with the holes in it to face towards the outside. It's going to sit just like this underneath the frame, just like you see there. Real quick before I install it, I want to show you those bolts and nuts that we were just removed, just so you can get a good look at those. So there's the bolt, here's the nut on the other side, that's that flange we were talking about. So when we go to put these in, you are going to have to twist the nut. you're going to have to twist the bolt to get it to thread into the nut, because you're not going to be able to spin this because of the flange. So now we're just going to take our bracket, we're going to hold it up into position, bring our bolts around from the outside, slide it on through. We're going to do the same thing with our other bolt here. Get both of those slid through. Now I'm just keeping a little pressure on the bolts so that way my bracket doesn't fall out of there. Now I'm just taking the nut and putting it on the other side. I'm holding it up to the bolt, and then I'm going to spin the bolt to thread it into the nut. And just in case it was confusing, This is the way it needs to face your bolt, just like this. So the tab actually goes away from the frame and then down. This is the end the bolt needs to go into, not this side. All right, once we get them both started, and you want to make sure you get them started by hand like that, so that way you don't cross thread them. We can then grab our impact once again, and we're going to zip these back down. Once you've got them zipped back down, you can grab your torque wrench and torque them to the specifications outlined in your instructions. And we might need to get a little bit shorter of an extension here in order to do this. We'll see where we're at here. Once you've got both of your side brackets installed, at that point, we can go ahead and head underneath the motorhome. At some point when you go to put the bar up, you are going to need to put it back down on the ground because we're going to need it to be in its normal resting position to install our bar. But for now, you can still continue to work on it with it raised up. I'll let you know when you have to have it back on the ground for everything to line up properly. Our shock here is in the way of where we're going to be mounting our sway bar. It's going to attach here to the back of the shock mount on each side. It's where the bushing caps are going to go. The bolt here that goes into this hole is going to be pretty much impossible to install with the shock in place. So we just got to rock this shock out of the way so we can get our hardware and then we can put this back. To remove the shock, we're going to remove or at least to move it out of the way, we're going to remove the bottom bolt here. We're going to use a 1 1/8 inch socket and wrench to do so. So just go ahead and put that on there, and then I'm just kind of bringing this up until it hits the axle. And then we can get the nut removed from it there. And you're probably going to need a breaker bar. If you can get an impact in here, that'd be your kind of your best bet, but it is a pretty tight area. All right, we've got it loose here. We're going to try switching to electric gun and see if we can't get it on there. If not, then we're going to switch to a ratchet because it's easier now. We don't need this full breaker bar, and we'll get that nut all the way off of there. The nut here might be hot if it was extremely tight, so just be careful with that when you remove it. All right, now that we've got that out, we're just gonna pull our bolt out of there. Sometimes it's easier to unthread the bolt than it is to just push it out of there. We're just gonna see here. This one's not too bad. I should have no problem pulling it out of there, but if yours is really tight, you may have to unthread it. I'd also consider pushing up on the bottom of the shock here just a little bit because the shock's trying to extend all the time, and it is going to extend once you pull this bolt out. You should be strong enough though to overcome the shock, so you just kind of push up just a little bit to relieve some of the pressure and slide the bolt out of there. And you can see here I'm holding the shock, preventing it from moving. I'm going to go ahead and let go, and you're going to see it's going to extend. There it goes. That's fine. Go ahead and let it extend. We can push it back in. Again, you should be able to push it back in by hand. It's not going to be the easiest thing, but it should be plenty doable. Just push it slow. It should slowly go back up when you push on it. Just like that. Now, if it goes up super easy, you probably got bad shocks and you probably need to service those while you're here. So now that we've got this removed, we're going to do the same thing on the other side over here for this other shock, so that way we can access the hardware on that side. So now we're just going to prepare some of our hardware. We're going to go ahead and take our hex head bolt here, place a washer on it, and we're going to drop this down through the holes here in our shock mount. The hex head one's going to go in the top hole, the one closest to the axle tube, and then you have these button head ones that come in your kit here. We're going to put a washer on it, but I'm pretty sure that we're going to be omitting this washer. If we have clearance issues with reinstalling our shock hitting the bolt head, you'll have to take the washer out of there and then put it back in, and that'll give you a little bit more clearance because of the head of the washer. But we're going to go ahead and start with it, and then I'm going to just take this and I'm just going to hold it up there and see if it's going to be possible for me to reinstall the bolt. If not, then I'm going to remove the washer and put it back in there, because it just kind of depends, just due to manufacturer variances, whether or not that's going to fit or not. It's actually that close, but that may or may not be acceptable. So slide it in. We're going to grab the big bolt that we had just removed from the shock. I'm going to push the shock back up. We don't want to fully reinstall it. We're just doing a test fit for that washer. And that's all you want to see. If you can push the bolt straight on through, washer stays. If you cannot get the bolt through because the shock is hitting the head of the bolt, washer must go. So we're good to go. It will clear here, so we're gonna leave it. So next we're gonna take our end links. They're gonna slide up in between the hangers that we put in place in that kind of first step. It does have 2 slotted holes here, so either one is going to potentially be usable. We're going to be leveling the sway bar when we get it in place. So for now, we're just going to put this up here, mainly just so we can kind of line things up again, so that it may not stay in the hole that we put it in here. So I'm just going to put it in the bottom one for now. So just line it up, just like that. Take your bolt. We want to go from the outside in, and then we're just going to lightly put the nut on there. And we don't want to tighten this down because, again, we may be moving this to the upper hole. If our sway bar is not sitting very parallel, we may have to move that. That's why we also have 3 slots down here below, so we can get that perfect adjustment on our sway bar. So we're gonna temporarily install the one on the other side the same way, because I prefer to hang my sway bar from these and then rotate it up into position. I find it a lot easier to manipulate the weight of the sway bar doing it this way, rather than lifting the sway bar up and attaching it to this hardware and then swinging it this direction. Whatever way works best for you, you can do, but I prefer to do it this way. So now we've got our sway bar here. We're gonna be putting it up here shortly, but we do gotta do a little bit of preparation to it first. These are our bushings with the end caps that come included with them. Go ahead and slide the end cap off. We'll be putting those on here in a moment, but for now we're gonna prepare the bushings and get them on the sway bar. You'll get some lubricant included in your kit here. We want to lubricate the entire interior of the bushing here. Now, some customers have indicated that they get irritation after contact with this grease on their skin. I've not noticed any myself, but everybody's different, so you know your body better than anybody, so just take the necessary precautions you think you need to protect yourself there. We're gonna put a nice generous coating here all across the inside. We're going to do the same thing on the other side of it here on the inside. And then once we've got the inside nice and coated, I always like to take the little bit of excess here that's on my finger and kind of smear the majority of it off inside. And then the little bit of excess that's on the outside here, I'll smear on the outside of the bushing. We don't want to have a lot of grease here on the outside, but just a little tiny bit can help to reduce any kind of squeaks, rattles, and noises. Once you've got it lubricated, the bushing is split, so we can open it up just like that and slide it over our end link. Once you've got that one installed on there, we're going to do the same thing and slide it on the other side. So now we're going to grab our sway bar, we're going to lift it up, and the end of our sway bar here we're going to put in between the end link that we had temporarily installed there. We're going to do the same thing on the other side, and once we hold it in there, we're going to slide our bolt through it and try and do this fairly quickly, so that way all the weight of this heavy bar here is going to be held by the bolts. So I usually use my body too to give me a hand a little bit. You can kind of rest it on your body some to help lift it up. Get your bolt through there. The powder coating is a little thick on that one, so it's a little stuck. No big deal. We're just going to move over to the other side. Get that one kind of started. There we go. Yeah, you got to tap them sometimes a little bit like that, just because of the thickness of the powder coating. And then we'll get our nuts temporarily installed in there as well. Now, we just chose the bottom hole because that was the easiest one to slide it in. Again, we might be moving this at a later point here to final adjust it, but it's a whole lot easier to have all this weight hanging from your end links, because now we're going to be able to just kind of swing it into position to install it over here. So once you've got it all hung like this, go ahead and grab your hanger. You can slide your hanger down over your bushing. We're going to do the same thing on the other side. Slide that one into place. So now we're going to swing it on up into position, slide it over our bolts. Trying to line up both sides if I can here. There we go. Got it on there. Once you get it into place, we're going to take one of these little washers that are kind of split like that, slide it on there. We're putting the flat side. I said split washer, but I meant flat cut, you'll want to put the flat side towards the bushing, and then take one of the lock nuts that come in your kit and thread it on the bolt. We're going to do the same thing with the other fastener here, and we're going to do the same thing here on the other side. So now we've got our bar up here and started. We're going to go ahead and snug our hardware down. We'll use a 15mm socket and wrench for the hex bolts. And then we're going to swap over to a 7/32 Allen and a 15 for the button head. And then we can go back and torque our bolts to the specifications outlined in our instructions. This is kind of the point where you got this installed, where we need to take this side loose, because if you're working at home and you still have your hydraulics for your leveling system holding your RV up, in order for us to get this appropriate to the appropriate adjustment, you need to be back down. So what I would recommend is taking this loose down here at the bottom. And we're going to be loosening this up for a couple of reasons. One, we're going to slide this out of here. We're going to do this on both sides. And what this is going to do for us is it's going to let us be able to put our motorhome back on the ground if you do still have it lifted up, because we don't want our bolts to be in both the top and the bottom, because it's going to put pressure on it when the vehicle goes back down. So we want one of the two bolts to be missing, so that way when we lower down we don't have no pressure on it, and then we'll choose the best spot and put our bolt in. But we also need to take our sway bar now and kind of just rotate it out of the way, because we need to put our shock back, but you got to torque these bolts first before you can put the shock back. And our sway bar now, when it's in position, prevents our shock bolt from being able to be reinserted. So well, at least we could probably maybe get it on there, but it's going to be really tight and difficult to get a nut on there. So it's probably just going to be easier to swing the sway bar out of the way, put the shock up, and then swing the sway bar back. So it might seem like we're doing kind of a little bit of back and forth, but the sway bar is extremely heavy, so that's why I prefer to do it this method, because that way you're using the least amount of energy holding this heavy component. You're just kind of moving some bolts around here and there while letting the bolts do all the heavy lifting. So we're going to loosen up this side, we'll swing it out of the way, and then we'll get our shocks in place. So we got our bolt, just like we did before. We're going to push it back up, push it in. I usually push it past where it needs to go and then let it kind of extend into position. It's usually the easiest way I find to get these installed. There we go, get that slid into place. And now we'll just go back and tighten down our shock bolts. And then we'll go back and torque these to the manufacturer's specifications. Now that we've got those tightened and torqued, we'll swing our sway bar back into position, and this is the perfect opportunity now to make our adjustments. So I did this already, I just kind of held it up there, and I wasn't happy with the end link being installed in the lower hole. Kind of just felt like it was hanging down a little bit too far, so I did move that to the upper hole. It is very important your vehicle is down on the ground at this point. We don't want it to be lifted by our jacks. And then you'll lift it up, and we're just trying to make it to where it's level between the frame and the ground. It's not uncommon to have to kind of push it a little bit to maneuver it. So we're gonna see here, that's the lower hole. That looks pretty good. What we're looking for is we want it to be parallel with the ground in our frame. Let's see, if we go up another hole, I would say that's about as perfect as we can get right there. That looks very parallel to the ground, very parallel to our frame. So we're gonna go with the middle hole. Slide your bolt through it and place your nut on the other side, and we're going to do the same thing at the other end of our sway bar. We can then go back and tighten down our end link bolts with a 15/16 socket and wrench. And we don't want to go too crazy with these. There is a torque spec that we'll want to torque it to at the end, but it's important not to over torque it. And then we'll go back and torque those to the specifications outlined in our instructions. All right, once we've got all of our hardware torqued down, at this point we're ready to go take it on a test drive. If you happen to hear any clunks or noises, just come back and double check the tightness of your bolts. One of them may not be quite all the way fully torqued down. And that completes our installation of Roadmaster Sway Bar on our 2015 Winnebago Vista.